everyone. It is a pleasure to welcome you to this event of the Joseph and Rebecca Meyerhoff Center for Jewish Studies here at University of Maryland. Whether you are here for family weekend or for extra credit, we are delighted to have you, and we are eager to talk with you about a topic that we think is remarkably relevant to our everyday life, and remarkably relevant to us, not only as people who are interested in religion, but also as people who are interested in America. My name is Max Grossman. I'm the director of the Meyerhoff Center, and I'm delighted that I will be joined today by Professor Matthew Suriano and Rabbi and Professor Ari Israel. I'm very sorry to say that Jen Gardner will not be here to present the legal side of things, so I have taken the liberty of putting some slides together to talk a little bit about the history of the law around the Ten Commandments of the United States, leading up to the event that spurred us to hold this session. I'm going to talk a little bit first then about law and America and how religion fits into that, and then I am going to hand the floor on to my colleagues. I believe there will be plenty of time for us to fight with each other and for y'all to also ask us questions. So I wanted to start, here we are with freedom and faith, the Ten Commandments in contemporary American society. We can go back and forth on any of the slides if you wish. I'll start with a quick observation. Notice, please, all students, that this is an acceptable use of Wikipedia, but only if you cite your sources. I wanted to give you a full color image to let you ask the question, which exactly are the Ten Commandments? It depends on which community you're a part of, which texts you're looking at, and how you break those texts up. So the starting point of saying there are 10 commandments, and they are the basis for Jewish life, Christian life, Western society, is something that needs to be dealt with, because we need to recognize that any rendering of the Bible is going to be based on the choices of the community that chooses that Bible. So if we say the Bible or the Ten Commandments, we are in a position of selecting whether we mean the Jewish Bible, Christian Bible, other kinds of Jewish or Christian Bibles, and also whether we mean the biblical material that we have from one book of the Bible or from another. So you can be a little selective there if you want and say, well, I'm thinking of breaking the fourth commandment, but I'm not sure which fourth commandment I'm going to break. Try to pick one that gives you a little bit more. One of the things that I have heard a lot in 20 years of thinking about religion in the United States is how we as a country negotiate our apparent secular identity with our shared values. And one of the things you sometimes hear people say is 10 commandments or 10 amendments. You know, of course, that the first 10 amendments to the Constitution make up what's called the Bill of Rights, and that the Bill of Rights is not only a legal document, but a philosophical one. It's a document that says that individuals matter, but that individuals are part of a new idea, an idea of a nation in which, theoretically at least, everyone has a say, and in which people work together. The premise of American public culture, as some of my students learned just this week from Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Sachs of Britain, is that America is both a democracy and a covenantal nation. And by covenant here, I mean, of course, the idea of a people connected to a set of norms and connected to a divine authority and a divine mission. Now, you might look at that and say, well, that's not what I learned in government class. I learned that the founders of the United States were deists, or they were secular, or they were atheists. All of those things are possible, but what they all had was a shared vision. How we articulate that shared vision is what puts us in the position that we're in today. Because if you look at the Bill of Rights, in particular if you look at the First Amendment, you see a vision that says society should be better. Society should be open to difference. Society should include everyone, but with standards that also protect everyone. So I would argue that part of the tension between commandments and amendments, or between democracy and covenant, is that the original founding of our country was negotiating both. Quakers should be able to live in this place and not get thrown out. Even Catholics should have a place here and feel like they are part of society. This is a situation that is really shocking and amazing, that you would build a nation and that you would welcome not only Protestants, not only Catholics, but both, and also people who aren't even Protestant or Catholic or Christian. So the vision of the United States and its reality come together with one another in a spirit that is indeed idealistic, but that negotiates its majority Christian origins, but its diverse Christian origins, in a way that make it hard to say exactly how pious an American secular society should be. When I think about the unique vision of American civil religion, I think about a revolutionary nation. And I also think about a land of immigrants, a land full of people who came from somewhere else. Now again, as I'm saying all this about idealism and one person and all together, I realize that not all of these ideas were held by everybody, and not all of these ideas worked out the way that we, looking back on it, might judge. So I'm talking about the concepts and the way we negotiate those concepts, and then you can go from there to ask about how that happens in real life on the ground. But indeed, the philosophy of America, e pluribus unum, out of one, many, one out of many, is that idea of both collective and individual or independent opportunity. Diversity, therefore, rooted in shared values. Now, all of that suggests some certain tensions. And those tensions are connected with the question of which values do we prioritize, and in what way do we prioritize them? I'm a big fan of thinking about the First Amendment, and I do believe you could teach a whole semester on it, if not a whole career. But the first bit of the First Amendment tells us that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. I am not a legal scholar. I'm curious to know what Jen Gartner would say, but my impression is that up until mid-century, free exercise was really the issue that was being negotiated in our on our public stage. And since then, there's been a shift to where we are now, where the Establishment Clause has been the center, has become the center of tension. And again, I would argue that it's become the center of tension precisely because of that combination of shared values and tensions around diversity. Just to remind you, and this I stole from the US courts, so I guess it's legal theft. The Establishment Clause prohibits the government from establishing a religion. Now, establishing a religion means something specific. Each of those words is a technical legal term. The precise definition of establishment is unclear, but historically it has meant prohibiting state-sponsored churches such as the Church of England. Sociologists remind us that the word church here is not a reference to a building. It's not even a reference to the community that worships in that building. Church in this case means the entity, the institution that has responsibility and authority over big ticket items like marriage, divorce, inheritance, the legality of a child's existence. All of those things are part of the organized church. So in the same way that the United States government is not going to decide what kinds of religious marriage are permitted, the United States government is theoretically not supposed to establish religious norms in other ways. That's what church means here. The Free Exercise Clause protects citizens' rights to practice their religion as they please, says the court, so long as the practice does not run afoul of a public morals or a compelling governmental interest. I think it's probably supposed to be afoul of public morals. Premise here being, as long as you don't appall other people, what you're doing should be okay. Now, this has been something that has really created tension. There have been moments in the past where under the Sherbert-Yoder, two cases, Sherbert and Yoder, the Sherbert-Yoder test said that as long as you are not causing harm, pretty much anything you do should be okay. That was unraveled in the late 20th, early 21st century around the Smith case, which was a case that said that free exercise did not extend to the use of psychedelic religious practices, at least not in a context that was state-sponsored. So as you can see, sometimes free exercise scares people. But the issue that we're looking at today is not so much about free exercise, unless it is, and it's really about establishment. 10 Commandments in the news. How many of y'all heard about this? Excellent, excellent. So in the news we found in June, the governor of Louisiana signed into law a ruling that every public school classroom must have not just a biblical text, not just the 10 Commandments, not just a poster, but a specific translation of a specific edition of the 10 Commandments in a poster-sized setting with nothing covering it and nothing changing it. It's a pretty good law in terms of getting what he wants. Maybe a little more problematic in terms of whether this is establishing not just Christianity, but a particular flavor of Christianity. Okay? If you want to respect the rule of law, you've got to start from the original lawgiver, which was Moses. Professor Suriano, I'm curious to know whether you're going to cause some problems for the fair governor when it's your turn to talk. Rabbi Israel, maybe you can help the governor out, I don't know.
I didn't vote for him.
So how might the court decide this ruling? We have a couple of possibilities. In 1980, precisely this kind of ruling in Kentucky was just slammed. They just said, nope, nope, nope. It's unconstitutional. It has religious impact. It has no secondary legislative or secular value. Boom. It is the establishment of religion. It is not okay. However, time went on. People who liked the Bible wanted to like the Bible more and more in more and more public ways. And in 2005, 2 different cases were decided, and the decision was tactically handed down the same day. In the first of those cases, by a 5-4 decision, displays of the 10 Commandments were declared unconstitutional when they appeared outside 2 courthouses in Kentucky under the claim that they weren't integrated enough into a larger historical display about the history of law. In contrast, same day, same court, same 5-4 score, but different people, voted in favor of permitting the Texas State Capitol to put up their display of the 10 Commandments because it contained both secular and religious elements. Now this goes back to certain rulings about that we also have about public displays around holidays. And I knew someone who called this the plastic reindeer rule, because cities, states, counties, and anyone else can have a big festive winter display with, you know, a creche and the baby Jesus and all kinds of nice, beautiful things, as long as there's at least one secular element, like one plastic reindeer, to indicate that this is the greetings of the season that's being celebrated, as opposed to, as some people put it, the reason for the season. So this is where we are now. We are sitting. This law, our friends in Louisiana are waiting right now. The law is frozen. It won't be put into place until at least November. Everyone's waiting to hear what the decision will be. Is this an example of an appropriate manifestation of the spirit of the American condition? Or is this an inappropriate, overly specific enactment of religion over the heads of a more diverse community? Yes.
Sorry, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Who's deciding that? Is it in the Supreme Court or like the state court?
Yeah, it's making its way up. Yeah, very interesting to see what's going to happen next. Yeah. Thank you all so much. I think that I'm going to stop there. Professor Suriano, would you like to step up? You're so good.
Thank you, Max. I to follow up with on that, and so just bear with us for a moment as we bring up the PowerPoint, because I have a visual presentation as part of my short talk participating in this panel. Now, my role here, I'm a professor in the Meyerhoff Center for Jewish Studies. I come from a Near Eastern background. That is, I study ancient languages, a lot of archaeology, and by virtue of that fact, I do what is popularly called biblical archaeology. So I teach a lot of classes here on campus that are about biblical literature, the formation of the Bible, about the biblical world. I teach occasionally classes on biblical Hebrew. Okay, so if I'm not teaching about Bible, I'm teaching a lot of classes that are Bible adjacent at a public university. So from that role, I can say that I'm not fundamentally against the teaching of Bible in public spaces, in public schools. It's just a question of how is that done, okay? So how do I do it here that doesn't violate the constitutional laws, the Establishment Clause, the amendments, and so on and so forth? Doesn't create a legal problem for the university? Well, I come from an approach that is sometimes called scripture in context. That is the study of biblical literature within the larger context of the ancient Near Eastern world or the ancient Mediterranean world, okay? It's also referred to as a historical critical approach. That is to say, it's not explicitly religious. It doesn't involve theological interpretation, which remains the domain of, say, confessional groups and denominations and religious quarters, okay? In fact, I would say it doesn't even really intrude upon those boundaries because it is, I used the word earlier, adjacent. I would say it's adjacent to that sort of education, okay? But what does that look like? Well, when I teach my class on the introduction to the Hebrew Bible / Old Testament, okay, I have a unit on the Ten Commandments, and we go over the various iterations of the Ten Commandments in Exodus and Deuteronomy, including the second giving of the Decalogue that's found in Exodus 34. I don't have time to get into that now, but it's basically, because Moses broke the tablets due to the whole golden calf episode, and so they have to write new Ten Commandments, which are given in Exodus 34. They're a bit different than what we find in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 5. But to focus on Exodus chapter 20, within the literary framework of the book of Exodus, okay, this is this statement, the Decalogue, or the Ten Commandments, begins the whole Sinai experience of the Israelites, okay? And so we have Moses addressing the Israelites, and he addresses the Israelites with a set of commandments. Now, from a legal perspective, what we teach our students is that the format of the laws that are given by Moses here are referred to as apodictic law, okay? Which is a fancy word for thou shalt not, okay? Don't do this, don't do that. They tend to be very short and terse and to the point. And so this is basically what the Ten Commandments are. And within this literary framework, they introduce then a series of much more complex laws that follow that begin in that same chapter. So that begin in Exodus chapter 20 and continue through chapters 21 and 22. And there we get a mixture of apodictic laws, but mostly what are referred to as casuistic law, okay? Which is, again, a fancy term for simply case laws. Case laws being the sort of laws that begin, if this or that happens, then this shall be the consequence, okay? And in the book of Exodus, the Decalogue serves as an introduction to a series of laws, a law code that's known as the Covenant Code, which is a very prominent part of Torah. It begins the whole Sinai episode, and there are a lot of interesting things within the Covenant Code. Now, again, I approach the Hebrew Bible from a historical, critical standpoint. So my interests are in the background of the Bible, the cultural framework of the Bible, and it's in the Covenant Code that we find a lot of parallels with ancient Near Eastern law. Okay? Most famously in the example of the Code of Hammurabi. Now, a lot of you know, I know you're like, wow, is that it? That is actually me up there on the stage. Standing next to the Code of Hammurabi in the Louvre. This was taken last year. The Code of Hammurabi, a lot of you already know about the Code of Hammurabi for reasons that I'll get into at the end of my little segment here. Really quickly, it was discovered by French archaeologists in 1901, excavating in Susa, what is today modern Iran. And so it's on display. It's displayed prominently in the Louvre. The Code of Hammurabi is famous because it's the longest and best organized ancient law code. It includes 282 laws that are chiseled into the black stone of the law code. It dates to the Old Babylonian period, to the reign of Hammurabi, the Babylonian king. So it dates to the 18th century, which is basically the 1700s, before the Common Era or before Christ, BC, BCE or BC, whichever you choose. Okay. In fact, all of these laws are case laws. There's a long epilogue that introduces Hammurabi and talks about his piety and why he's interested in justice. And then we have a bunch of laws, and then we have an ending. There's a prologue, set of laws, and then an epilogue that kind of summarize everything and affirm Hammurabi's role as the lawgiver. Okay, the artifact itself. And we have a lot of copies also in the ancient world of the Code of Hammurabi, but this is by far the most intact and elaborate one. It displays Hammurabi standing before Shamash, the god of the sun, the Babylonian god of the sun. And those of you who might know some Hebrew can recognize Shemesh as a cognate term for Shamash, which is just simply the Babylonian word for sun in the Semitic language of the Babylonians, known as Akkadian. And so he's receiving the law from the god of law, the sun god Shamash. And then beneath this portrait at the top of the stela is an elaborate legal code. Okay? That legal code is written in cuneiform. And so the cuneiform is a writing system. It's not a language, but it's a writing system that was used by the Assyrians and Babylonians. It was invented earlier by the Sumerians, going back to the end of the 4th millennium. So it's the world's earliest writing system. And so this is what it would have looked like. Now, when we start looking at the Code of Hammurabi and comparing it with the Bible, we see that there is a lot of similarities, like most famously, the so-called lex talionis, the eye for an eye clause, okay? Which we find also in the book of Exodus in chapter 21, verses 23 through 25. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, beating for beating, okay? We also have particular case laws, such as the ox that gores, okay? So different scenario if you happen to be walking your ox through a town in a public space and it gets loose and it injures somebody, here are the various penalties depending on the circumstances, okay? And so we have this in the Code of Hammurabi. We also have this in the Covenant Code, and again in chapter 21 of the book of Exodus. So there are strong parallels there. It's not that the book of Exodus is derived from the Code of Hammurabi, okay? Although the Code of Hammurabi is much earlier than the book of Exodus, regardless of which biblical chronology you subscribe to. It's just that both participated in a much larger and very ancient tradition of laws and law codes. Now, the thing about the Code of Hammurabi is that it is actually currently being taught in public schools. In the state of Maryland, along with other states, it's part of the 6th grade curriculum for world history, or curricula, depending on which system they're utilizing, which types of units. So it's either part of world history or social studies. And within that, within each curricula, the students learn about, for example, the eye for an eye phenomena in the Code of Hammurabi. It's taught as one of the earliest examples of a law code that includes proportionality. That is, you will be penalized in proportion to what you've done wrong, okay? And there are other aspects to the Code of Hammurabi that are taught in our schools as part of world history units that look at the foundations of early civilization, the foundations of early law, or some of the earliest law codes, okay? The Code of Hammurabi did involve laws that applied to everyone, okay, regardless of whether you were a slave or whether you were free. However, it didn't prescribe equal justice for all, okay? And so full citizens got more rights than commoners, and both groups were more privileged than slaves, okay? But it's there already in our public school curriculum. However, I'm not sure, and I kind of gathered this from talking to my son, who was a former 6th grader at Catonsville Middle School, who learned about the eye for an eye clause, but I don't think the biblical connections were necessarily taught, okay? They were left kind of to the side. They were left for students to kind of figure out on their own because it wasn't part of the curriculum. And so this brings me to the more recent news in the state of Louisiana, and something that's very similar is going on in Oklahoma, where we have this effort to enforce the 10 Commandments as part of the public display of schools and courthouses. The statement by the governor of the state of Louisiana that you have to respect Moses as the original lawgiver is directly contradicted by, you know, Hammurabi and the whole historical phenomena of Hammurabi. And Hammurabi wasn't even the earliest lawgiver. I mean, there were earlier Babylonian laws known as the laws of Eshnunna that predate Hammurabi by 50 to 100 years. And then if you get into Sumerian law during the 3rd millennium, you know, you could go back 200, 300, 400 years earlier than Hammurabi with Ur-Nammu, the Sumerian king. So, I mean, Hammurabi was just simply taking something that already existed and packaging it in a specific way in order to affirm his own authority as king and present himself as a law-respecting, law-giving king, okay? But how would that then fit with a curriculum that now includes the 10 Commandments? And that's the question that I have, and it's not one that I have any good answers for you other than, well, this is how I do it here at the university. And it's not like, and then here's where I'm going to end with a few kind of interesting images. It's not like the connection between Moses and Hammurabi is something new in American culture. So what I'm going to end with doesn't have to do with public schools. It has to do with the U.S. Capitol building and the House chamber. Okay, overlooking the entrances to the House chamber is a lot. There's a lot of artwork, quite beautiful, including relief portrait plaques of lawgivers. Okay, and so aligned along the 4 walls are 23 portraits in profile of lawgivers that include Thomas Jefferson, Mason, and others, you know, from American history, a lot of British and French figures, including Napoleon, Suleiman, the Turkish emperor, who's famous today for having built the old city walls in Jerusalem. He's up there. Maimonides is there as well. But on the eastern wall, facing Thomas Jefferson on the western wall, okay, and facing a quote by Webster, which really doesn't have anything to do with the individual lawgivers, is a panel that includes ancient legal authorities. Okay, most of them are, well, here we go. Most of them are Greek or Roman figures, with 2 exceptions. The main exception is Moses. And in fact, he's exceptional not just because he sits at the center, okay, but he's the only one who's not shown in profile. He's looking straight forward, and all of the portraits on either side are in profile, are looking either to the right or to the left, whichever, in relation to where they are relative to Moses. So they're looking at Moses. Now this was commissioned in 1949, and these portraits were that's my time. These portraits were finished in 1950, but we have all these figures who are staring at Moses, which definitely privileges Moses as this great lawgiver, including our friend Hammurabi, or at least somebody who's supposed to be Hammurabi. Okay? Now this is what it says if you go to the the website of the U.S. Capitol building, Moses, who lived somewhere between 1350 and 1250, I won't say anything about that, Hebrew prophet and lawgiver, transformed a wandering people into a nation, received the 10 Commandments. Okay? So that's why he's given this important place inside the halls of government, overlooking Congress. Okay? And immediately to his right is what's supposed to be Hammurabi, who's identified, the dates are actually, fairly okay. King of Babylonia, author of the Code of Hammurabi, which recognized in legal literature as is recognized in legal literature as one of the earliest surviving legal codes. So we have this already in the Capitol building, in the iconography and art of our Capitol building, this connection between Moses and legal traditions here in the United States and Hammurabi. And it doesn't violate, I would say, the Establishment Clause, because Moses is presented in a larger cultural and legal context and framework. Okay, and so that's where I kind of want to end, although I have to point out, this isn't actually Hammurabi.
That's Shamash.
It's Shamash. So the artist who used the Code of Hammurabi as his model copied the wrong guy. Obviously, he was influenced by the fact that Shamash is on the throne. So, so this, Mesopotamian scholars are well aware of this. If anyone's interested, I would love to start a movement to have this portrait replaced with an actual image of the Babylonian king, or at least amend the website on the U.S. Capitol building so it says 22 historical individuals and 1 Mesopotamian god. I prefer the other alternative. But that's what I have to say, and I guess that is your time.
Fascinating, informative, and fun. Good, sir.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ari Israel, and thank you, Dr. Grossman. Thank you,
Rabbi Israel.
Dr. Suriano, for having us, and all of you students for getting extra credit. It is amazing what you would probably point on your degree, but I assume you're all here to be entertained by them. I will just be the backbone, etc. So this is my 22nd year here. I am an adjunct professor, easy A, just letting you know, College of Education. So I apologize to my professors over here. I did give an F last year, so I felt good about that. My only challenge with the entire subject, and I'm not going to offend Dr. Grossman for inviting me, but I may not be invited back, is that from a Jewish perspective, and that's the only perspective I can give, my own, is that there actually are not 10 commandments.
That's why we invited you.
There are no commandments from that perspective. The Hebrew translation is Aseret HaDibrot. Dibrot are 10 sayings. So nowhere in the Torah, nowhere in my Torah, I'm not familiar with the entire Christian or Hammurabi code, does it say anywhere that there were 10 commandments. There are commandments listed in the Bible. There are plenty of commandments. Some of those commandments are repeated in the 10 sayings, such as do not kill, which it says several times in the Bible. As Dr. Grossman, Professor Grossman brought up before, there are many different enumerations of how we get to the 10 sayings. This is just happens to be a traditional Jewish one. I have a different slide, distinction between the Catholics and the Protestants. The first one is actually the biggest challenge, even within rabbinic sources. So the rabbis take the Torah, take the Bible, and argue plenty of times and saying, well, how do we interpret this? So great scholars, Maimonides on one hand being one of those scholars who lived in the 1235 to 1304, so the 14th century, who passed away in the 14th century. Maimonides actually does not list, I am the Lord your God, as one of the commandments. It's a premise to say, I'm God, and therefore I can command you to do things. But I can't force you to believe in something. I can't get into your head. I can only enforce, the rabbis in particular ones interpret this, I can only enforce Sabbath observance. Don't kill, don't steal, but I can never enforce belief. I can't have a mind police. God can have a mind police. That's my relationship with God. But the community cannot enforce a mind police. And therefore, I am the Lord thy God is a beautiful statement, which is a premise leading up to so many other things that I need to do. Observing the Sabbath, being a good person, giving charity, so many other commandments. But the actual tenet of belief in God is not a commandment according to many of the rabbinic sources. It's a premise, it's a foundation. However, traditionally, this is how it's listed. And what's amazing is in the probably 2nd, 3rd century, when Rabbinic Judaism was forming, and there are 2 scholars in this room who are, I see 2 of them, who are experts in Rabbinic Judaism. I just practice and play when on TV, but far from an expert. The reality is the 10 Commandments were included in daily ritual prayer in Jewish synagogues. Liturgy is, we talk about belief, we talk about community, we talk about praise, we talk about asking for things, and the 10 Commandments, the 10 sayings, were actually included until the rabbis came along and excised them and said, we're not going to include them anymore, because what happened is actually what happened with this lecture today, is that we are all gathered here for the 10 Commandments, and Rabbinic Judaism says there's 613 commandments. So why are these 10 and not important versus any others? And the rabbis actually said they're not that important. They're just 10 of 613. And Rabbinic Judaism has this belief that all 613 commandments, all 613, the entire Torah was commanded and given to Moses on Sinai at that one time, and not just these 10. The other challenge with these is that the rabbis do come along and say the first 2, which is I am the Lord thy God, and the second one is don't have any other gods except for me, there's no idolatry, are actually stated in first person. The other 8 are all about second person. Don't take thy name in vain, because God shall punish you. Don't covet, and God is in the second person. And I'm not going to go into all the details, but the distinction, and the rabbis point out, is that God spoke to the Jewish people at Sinai, and the Jewish people said, enough. You, Moses, finish this. I can't handle a relationship with God directly. And they actually had this intermediary, Moses, who then climbed up the mountain and received the rest of them. And that's the distinction between the 2. A relation with God, and actually a separation from the people and God. So first of all, that's what I wanted to say from that perspective. I do want to talk about Louisiana for a moment, and I know this is not going to tick off too many people here at the University of Maryland, but we are a big state school, publicly funded institution, and I'm going to say not more than a football field, maybe 2 football fields from here. I think the mall's that way. Where am I? Seriously, mall's that way?
No, mall's that way. I think what you're looking for is that way.
Mall's that way, so I'm looking for that way.
Yep.
So 2 football fields. Is that about right?
Not even.
Not even. Is a large church called the Memorial Chapel, planted and built in the University of Maryland in the 1950s. So this great state school has a church, which ostensibly is not a church, but when it was built in the 1950s, my predecessors, the Hillel community, actually if you walk into this chapel, and the chapel is a non-denominational building, so there are no overt signs in this building, but you walk into the building, the West Chapel was actually the place where the Jews were given a small little room, and the large room was given to the Catholic and Protestant communities. Fast forward, that was built in the 1950s. Sometime in the 1990s, the Muslim community was given space in Cole Fieldhouse, which is, I guess, that way. And now there's religious space on this campus for the Muslim and Christian communities. The Jewish community decided we don't want to have space on this campus, we have our own space, but we legally could be given space on a big public school, which is sort of a radical idea that the state is actually investing dollars in religions on this campus. Waiting for a lawsuit, so I'm just waiting for one of you to start fighting. As a matter of fact, state dollars 3 years ago were used to, what's the right word? Renovate the Muslim center on campus. So I think we just need to put that out there, that the University of Maryland also has religious places that are paid for and are used in that space. And that might go against what, oh my gosh, separation of church and state, but here we have church, in this case, embedded within the state proper. So personally for me, I'm very comfortable with the government not dictating what my religious beliefs should be. But I also don't want a government that is sterile of and not involved to some extent in helping us all think through what values are all about. I don't want the government, I'm very opposed to Louisiana, dictating to me what the laws should be. And I am also comfortable receiving money from that state government, for example, FEMA, or security funds. Congress has passed that we should invest in homeland security funds. Synagogues, churches are able to secure those funds. I'm very comfortable with that. That's not where the government is sterile. We're not in communist Russia, which means that I can't identify with any type of church. But I don't want the government saying it can only go to this church and not any church. It should go to all or none. And the challenge for me with Louisiana is that there is a certain segment saying this is the way it's going to be. And as a minority in a Christian country, and as Professor Grossman articulated, this country was founded on those Christian values. I'm very comfortable being a minority. And I'm very blessed that America has given me and the Jewish people a place where we can worship and serve. And where I get afraid is where government in Louisiana in particular is saying, this is the way you have to believe. And they may come along and say, well, we'll include Judaic values. But as a minority, I want to say, well, what about Muslim values? What about other values? And as soon as we start to pick apart and say the majority's in charge and the majority wins, then we actually all lose. What I want to end with for a second is my second slide, Doctor. Did you get a chance to... Oh no, this is fine. We're going to stick it. We're fine. Okay. So I was privileged in my last year of rabbinical school, where I studied in Israel in the 1990s. I became a rabbi in 96 actually, and I started my Hillel career at the University of Rochester and came to Maryland in 2002. I studied with an amazing biblical scholar. Her name was Nechama Leibowitz. Nechama Leibowitz's credentials was that in traditional Judaism, women did not have a prominent role. And women up until sort of in the 1920s, when women were able to vote in this country. That was the first time there was a bat mitzvah in this country as well, in the 1920s and 1930s. I think Mordecai happened his daughter. So women did not have a lot of rights in the United States of America. And in Judaism as well, there was not an equal opportunity for women to have that. Nechama Leibowitz was a blaze runner, an individual who sort of broke through that and was a teacher of all teachers. I was the last rabbinic class to study with her. She passed away a few months after I became a rabbi in that following year. And Nechama actually, her name was, I go by Ari. I want people to call me Ari. Nechama, I went to her house every Sunday morning. She was a woman in her 90s at the time. And she actually asked us to call us Nechama, and that was her name. She was a petite woman with a powerful voice and an amazing intellectual mind who taught scores and generations of rabbis. So Nechama says, please call me Nechama, and I ask, please call me Ari, which is sort of in a tribute to an amazing teacher. And Nechama shared the following, which I actually think is an opportunity for all of us to think about how these 10 sayings can influence who we are as individuals. I don't want the government doing that, but I want all of us to think about what our values are and not to put those apart. Judaism believes who is wise, those who learn from all people. I believe all religions, all of us have what to learn from one another. And hopefully Nechama's teaching can be something that we can think about. Nechama actually looks at these 10 commandments and sees two parallels. Judaism actually looks at them in two sets, two tablets. The tablets on the left and the tablets on the right. The tablets on the left, the first two are about a relationship with God. One is belief in God and one is don't have other gods. The yin and the yang. Number 3 is talking about speech. Don't take God's name in vain. Which means if you're going to revere God and you're going to think about what God means, then think about it and don't sort of curse, not just simply your speech is that important, but also recognize here that God is important for all of us and not to just throw God lightly away. Number 4 is about the Sabbath, which is observation on every Friday night, including tonight. And number 5 is about relationship with parents. On the right side, we have stealing, adultery, and murder. Murder, adultery, and stealing. Followed by false witnesses. And the last one is about covenant. And the Chama says I have an interesting pattern that develops here. The first two, number 1 and number 2, belief in God, don't have others, is all about belief in my head. Number 3 is about speech. Don't take God's name in vain. 4 and 5 are about doing something. Observe the Sabbath. Keep the Sabbath. Light Shabbat candles, which is not in the Bible but rabbinic, but do something about it. Say prayers on the Sabbath. Honoring parents as well as actually serving those parents. Not just, hey, good morning, but the rabbis go into long details about how do you honor your parents and bring them their clothing and feed them, all that stuff that me as a sandwich generation and children, hopefully, and students in this room are not thinking about yet, but I guarantee you there's that ability to serve parents. So number 1 and 2 is about belief, 3 is speech, 4 and 5 is action. The Chama actually flips it. She looks at number 6, 7, and 8. Those are actually all about action. Killing, adultery, and stealing. Number 9 brings us back to speech. And number 10, covet, is in your mind. And the Chama says, why is it when it comes to relationship with God, which is really the first 5, parents doesn't necessarily fit in that one, but it is on that. I can go into long rabbinic rides there. But when it comes to relationship with God, I start in the head, and I end up with action. When it comes to human beings, because the last 5 are all about me and other fellow human beings, I start with action, and I end with belief. And the Chama says, when it comes to relationship with God, the only way it could begin is in your heart and in your mind. Especially because Judaism doesn't have idols and doesn't have physical places for you to worship. It has to be in an idea. But it's not enough to be a Jew or a person only in your heart. You have to do something about it. You take an idea that begins in your heart and in your mind, it bubbles out through your mouth. And your mouth is actually the intersection between inside and outside. You're hearing in your head my voice, but my voice is because the wind is from my heart and from my mind. I'm not talking about the biology here, but it gets into your mind. And then ultimately I get to my hands and I actually have to do something about it. But when it comes to fellow human beings, I can never control what I think. The only way to judge another human being is to interact, is actually be a good person. So make sure you respect that other person. Don't kill them, don't steal them, and don't commit adultery. But it's not enough just to keep your distance from them. Hopefully your actions of interaction between you and people will bring us to speech. And don't only not kill your fellow human being, but be careful the way you speak about them as well. At the end of the day, if we're really a good person, valuing what we want to strive for to be a better person, hopefully we'll get to a belief that my fellow human being is also important in my head. And I'm not thinking a racist thought in my head, but I wouldn't say it publicly. Or I wouldn't think about, I don't really like you. I won't do it publicly. I won't hate you or steal from you. We all agree on that. But the question is, can I get to a concept of actually loving my fellow human being in my head as well? And that's what the Chama looks at. So these 10 sayings are actually a format for all of us. There's a belief system in God, which has to actually lead to action. But more important, there's an action system for human beings, which hopefully will lead to belief, to make us all a better person, not simply in our actions, but in our minds as well. Thank you.
This was wonderful. Suriano, would you like to come on as well? Thank you all. We have some time for questions, comments, engagement. I think these are very different presentations, but I think they speak to each other in interesting ways. Do some of y'all have questions you'd like to ask? Please.
Is there, do you agree, or any of those, see any center value to the 10 Commandments alone? These specific sayings displayed by themselves?
I had thoughts like that, but we're going to respond.
Since you're leaving first.
Do I think they should be, you mean, displayed in public places or?
Is there any reason why a person completely secular would look at these specific 10 sayings by themselves?
So I would be opposed to them being there. Because what I would then ask is that if there's another religion or another idea, we start putting them all up. And once you start putting them all up, you can't put any on. That's my
Although,
challenge.
to be fair, the other alternative is, as Matt showed us, you put a lot of things up.
No, but in Louisiana in particular, and I'm not saying you're saying Louisiana, if Louisiana is willing to then say, okay, we'll put up Muslim thoughts and put up, Chinese Buddhist statements and we start putting all that, then where do we stop?
Well, I would say institutionally that makes a lot of sense to me. Personally, if you're talking about the objective value of these ideas, I remember the first time I encountered the Tao Te Ching, and I bought a book about the Tao Te Ching, which is the philosophical basis for the Taoist tradition. And I remember it had beautiful photographs, and I was reading them, and I was like, wow, this is so cool. This is really great. Oh, I really don't like that one. And the experience of reading the Tao Te Ching in isolation, it's more than 10 statements, but it's not more than 100. I had this moment of, I see this and I don't see this. And I think that to the extent that the Ten Commandments can serve as something that people can see, but also the option of not liking, or have the option of engaging with differently, I see value in that. I don't think that just randomly putting the Ten Commandments up on various walls will necessarily do us much good.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I don't, personally, I struggle with the value of just simply putting up a copy of the Ten Commandments on a wall or a statue in front of the courthouse. I see it more as theatrics. That doesn't necessarily contribute to the greater good of society. Whereas the teaching of the Ten Commandments within a classroom in a specific context, or at least the teaching of Moses as a figure who's identified with ancient traditions of law giving, contextualized as it is in Congress, in a larger framework of the history of lawgivers, I don't have a problem with that.
And you know what, actually, even more than the Ten Commandments, you know what I do think has intrinsic symbolic worth is when people wear a cross or a crucifix or a Jewish star or carry prayer beads. When people manifest for themselves what might be for themselves their Ten Commandments or their key ideas. Because in all honesty, I think that's what the United States offers us, the opportunity for individuals to own publicly and safely their tenets and values.
I have a quick question about, so in like the Pledge of Allegiance, it's always taught, you have to say under God, and you're never really taught about that. Have there been any cases, Supreme Court cases, anything like that about?
Well, the under God part of the Pledge of Allegiance is actually later than Memorial Chapel. So it is not, under God is not from of yore in terms of that pledge, and it's specifically associated with a moment in American history when Christianness, but also religiosity, were put up against a godless communist exterior. So that this was a time when there was a revving up of what were viewed as benign symbols of religion. Yeah, so it's got a historical origin, but that historical origin is precisely about a very mild establishment, or not so mild establishment, of church in our sphere.
The only thought I have, and the University of Maryland follows this, but so does Congress, and I was been in Annapolis, is I'm comfortable with a ecumenical prayer, opening up a session in Congress or graduation, commencement, as long as there's opportunities for other people to say that. And we at Maryland do a great job with our multifaceted chaplains who all take turns. Now, if someone will come along and say, I'm not represented, that's going to happen. Right? So as a Jew who's sitting there and a Catholic gets up and prays, we actually try our best to use sort of communal language. But not everyone's great about that. Right? When a Catholic gets up and prays in the name of Jesus Christ, that makes me uncomfortable. It really does. So if I'm an atheist student in the audience at a commencement and chaplain gets up and says in God, using that language, I can see where it makes the person uncomfortable. And therefore people say it shouldn't be there. I'm comfortable with it being there. I just want it to be sort of language that is a little bit more inclusive. And that's a fine balancing act, and not everyone hits it. I don't hit it myself when I do that sometimes. I try, but it doesn't always work. So even the word God doesn't work for everyone using that.
I think in contemporary society we talk a lot about the implications of actions and like the impact they have on people and causing someone to suffer even if you didn't mean to. But in the context of a conversation about religion, I think intention matters. So if I'm with somebody and they, if someone comes up with a prayer that is more exclusive than I would like, but I know they were trying, I'm much more willing to say, ooh, I didn't like that, let's move on, But when someone does it and you know that it's sort of carefully geared, that's more upsetting.
Yeah.
It probably goes back to where are you a particularist, which means many clergy are living in their own church, their own synagogue, right, and are not involved. Here at the University of Maryland, we live in a society of others, so we are a little bit more respectful. I agree with Max. There was a fight about 15 years ago in the Senate. If you were here, I think Eli was here. You were.
Faculty Senate?
There is no faculty senate in
There
Maryland.
is, but,
Oh, there is?
Oh, the University Senate?
The University Senate about prayer in commencement. There's people, I don't know, sued, and that's probably a wrong term nowadays, but definitely were challenged, and I think the Senate came up with a compromise. There was going to be a moment of silence and a prayer. So now we're going to tick off everyone. But
there you go.
but that's what they were. I remember that. That was probably about 15 years ago when they instituted the moment of silence after the chaplain's prayer. But they kept the chaplain's prayer.
Was that for people to say no, 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 no in their heads if they disagreed?
Yeah, I mean, that was constituted. Turn their back on the chaplains.
There you go. Do you need to?
I'm fine with other violence.
Excellent.
I just, we, at part of Family Weekend, we have a Holocaust survivor, 91-year-old, coming to speak at Hillel at 2:30, so I gotta go greet him. So.
Other questions? Yes.
So I'm going to try and connect the two talks, Max and Ari. I found with a question and comment, Shamash, I was familiar with Hammurabi laws, not the Shamash, which to me looks like a soft serve ice cream kind of a thing.
Yeah, it's a horn cap that they use in Mesopotamian iconography to show who is a god and who isn't.
Fantastic. Interesting. Shamash is the starter candle in Hanukkah, so I wonder if there's a connection there. We can kind of crisscross there.
Yeah, I can't say.
No?
I don't say any connection. I mean, you are Israeli and speak Hebrew, so Shamash, as Matt references, Shemesh, right? Shemesh is sun. Shamash, and what you're referring to, is someone who serves someone else. So it could be soft serve, as you were saying. I'm not convinced that there is a connection.
Was there a question or comment up here?
No, I mean, I guess to your point, Ari, that where does it begin, where does it end in terms of the it's a slippery slope in terms of what you present and how much of it you present. So in my mind, it seems to be, when it comes to church and state, it should be a lot more black and white, because we are, by introducing these concepts, these prayers, these statements into the public square, you do create that tension and that friction among the different classes of people who have different beliefs. So I'd like to see it more as black and white. Church and state, it has to be separate. You can't infuse, the conversation with religion and religious overtones. So I'm just curious about your thoughts about, why shouldn't it or why can't it be that distinct and separate?
So that's where I appreciate that. I really do. I think that's a balancing act. I don't have a great answer myself. I'm not comfortable with dogmatic Louisiana, here it is, take it or leave it, right? Because that's what they're saying. It's a Christian society in a Christian-oriented state and a Christian governor and a Christian legislative saying this is what we're doing, and we are pretending we're including the Jews, Judeo-Christian, so that we checked off that box, right? They probably would not be comfortable putting up a Quran statement there, right? I'm making that up. My problem was, well, if you start putting up a Quran statement, which I'm okay with, right? Then you're just have to put up this statement and my statement, then you're in trouble. So I want none from that perspective. But I also do not want government a-religious all the time either. So I'm comfortable with prayer in front of at an opening Congress, as an example. I'm comfortable with FEMA, right? So FEMA, when there's a hurricane, so government's going to help, contribute funds to rebuild certain things. And a church applies; they can apply for those funds, right? I don't know exactly every case if that's accurate, but I do know Homeland Security money is funding churches and synagogues. I'm comfortable with that. So now, are they dictating what's happening inside that church? No, but they're enabling that church to, have prayer on Sunday morning with a police officer paid for by the church, by the government, right? And you'll say, well, no, we don't want any part of it. But they're helping, they're enabling. I think that's okay if government is enabling others to identify, as long as they're not penalizing, right? So if another religion comes along and says we want funds, by all means, church, which would then take away from my funds, right? Because if there's only X dollars, and synagogues, churches, and mosques are taking it, and then a fourth religion comes along, right? So then my church, my synagogue gets fewer funds. I'm fine with that. But I don't want aseptic. I just don't want it, caustic. And that's a balancing act. I do agree. I don't have a great answer.
I saw two other hands up. Did you have a comment? Okay. Would you like to comment?
He was talking about how to find that balance and that being a difficult thing, but your comment about intentionality, I think, is something to take in consideration. If someone's trying to do their very best and maybe they are not as inclusive as they would like to be, you say, well, intentionality matters. Okay. In the case of trying to put something up that doesn't make us so that we are a-religious, but is also not trying to push anything, it feels like intentionality would matter then too. I think that's one of the reasons why the Louisiana thing touches so many nerves across the board. Even people who are religious feel uncomfortable about it because intentionality matters.
Yeah. And I would even probably go so far as to say intentionality matters, and what you do after you hear critique matters. Yeah. Yes.
What bothers me the most is when people say, oh yes, this is what we all have to believe, and then they overtly violate. Overtly violate. It's the ultimate in hypocrisy. When people lie through their teeth and commit adultery and everybody knows it, and they say, oh, we are the best Christians. That's what bothers me. That's intentionality too.
That is indeed. And you have a long history of Greek philosophical and political tradition that demonstrates a way to not do that, which doesn't seem to be upheld these days.
I'll just defend. There are some honest clergy.
On that note, should we let you flee to your people?
I'm going to flee unless there's other.
Okay, big round of applause for. Thank you so much. I couldn't have asked for more. We have time if y'all want to stay for another couple minutes.
If you need to leave, we know this is family weekend, so don't feel that you're being held here, but we are happy to stick around and answer any further questions, converse with people in the front here.
Sign you up for a major or a minor.
So thank you very much for coming, but are there any further questions? Or?
Maybe if you have questions, come back and we can hang and talk together. Thank you all so much for being here.